G'day everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. Today we're going to basically build what I did in the last video from scratch. So I got the same hands here, and I'm going to make an FK chain, I'm going to make an IK chain, I'm going to make a Bendy bone chain, and then I'm going to make a Spline IK chain. So this is not too difficult to do. Just be aware that you have to follow a few housekeeping rules when it comes to these sort of things. So I would suggest you make a new collection and call it armature, and then have another collection called, geometry, so geo. In this case, I have the hands all individually modeled, but what I'm going to do today, I'm actually going to just merge them all together into one mesh, just so I can work with the same armature to give you an idea of what to do. So you don't have to use the same armature for this task. If you want to try and do this out, you can make individual rigs if you want to, but I'm just going to keep it all in the same family. So I'm going to select all of these hands and push Control J to join, and then I'm going to make a new armature object, single bone. Make sure it's at the 0 space, and also make sure that you have automatic keyframing turned off, because that's going to get in the way. Anyway, to start off with, let's turn on a few things. So in the viewport visibility display, and notice I'm using 2.9 now, so the interface might be a little bit different if you haven't updated, but in the object settings here under viewport display, turn on in front and have display textured as wire. That makes life a lot easier to see things. Alright, so let's tap straight into front view. And what we need to do is select this bone, and I'm going to extrude out a hand just for the hell of it, and then with this arm I'm going to subdivide it and place that bone just around the elbow point of that hand. Another thing I want to do as well is in the armature viewport display, not just the object viewport display, but the armature, I want to turn on axes so I can see the axes that I'm working with. So the axis directions are fine for this task, but if you wanted to do something a bit more consistent and you want to, say, have the arms rotate around the x-axis, you would have to change the roll to complement that. So the roll would be around like something like that, so minus 90 degrees in this case, and you'd see that change happen. So when you want to rotate along that elbow, for instance, and you have it set to the right Euler, so in this case it's XYZ, and you rotate it in the X, it will rotate in the positive direction in the X for that elbow to work. So just be aware of that, and be conscious of the direction of your joint orientation, bone orientation, so your X, Y, and Z. That's really important. And if you haven't seen my previous series on building a basic robot arm rig, I'd highly suggest you check that out, because I go into more detail about axes and shit like that. So just be aware. All right, so for the actual elbow, I'm going to keep things a little bit consistent across the FK and IK, because with the IK you need to have a very slight bend, like so, enough that it just gives the IK control an indication of the right orientation. Another thing I've noticed is that the orientation isn't perfect, so I want to make sure it's perfect with this one at the bottom. So I want to select this one, and this one, and push Shift N, and then I want to recalculate the roll to match that bone here. So I want to match it to the active bone, and that's all sorted now. So that's all perfectly aligned now with this bottom bone, which is nice to have. All right, so for the second lot, so for the IK, I'm just going to duplicate that and set it aside, and I'm going to snap it to that hand there, and we'll get back to that one later. I'm going to duplicate that again, and I'm going to slide it across to this hand here, but this case I'm not going to have a bone in between. I'm going to have a single joint that's connected here. So this is just to demonstrate the way that bendy bones work. So we'll get to that later. And then for this one, the Spline IK, I'm going to duplicate that. And for now, I'm going to subdivide this a few times like so. So I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bones there to play with. So that's our basic setup for these this demonstration and how to work out those. So let's start with the FK. So what I want to do first is I want to rename all these bones to suit the this demonstration. So I want to make sure I'm labeling everything appropriately, because what we need to do is create a nomenclature or a naming convention that works across everything, because all of these joints are going to be deform joints. So they're deforming the hands, okay? So what we need to do is make sure that we name things appropriately. So I want to call this one def underscore FK hand .001. And I'm going to keep that naming convention for this one. Look what I looked up on Google earlier. Grab that one, and I'm going to paste it in, and I'm going to call this one FK bicep. There. And this one forearm. All right. I'm going to do the same thing for these ones, so I'm going to make sure that I name things appropriately. So I want to say, in this case, def IK. Def IK. Copy def. Okay. So. Cool, so now I know that this one's for the FK deformation, this one's for the IK deformation, and this one's a little bit different because I'm going to call it BB for bendy bone. So def BB hand and def BB arm. And when you're building a proper rig, you don't have to name it this way. I'm just doing it for this demonstration. So normally you would have a deformation joint chain. So you just call it def arm, def leg, def, head joint, all that sort of stuff. But because I want to keep things nice and consistent across everything, I want to make sure that when I'm selecting things, I know that it is for the deformation of the FK, example here. For this one, I'm just going to say, def SP IK spic hand. Copy that, and I'm just going to say for the rest of this joint chain, I'm just going to go def IK arm, just for now, because it's just going to be the same behavior as this arm. So there's no bicep and forearm in this example. And you can see the nice thing about Blender is that when you just paste things in, it automatically numbers things, which is really nice. Cool. All right, so that's our setup up and running. So let's focus on the FK for now. But first, let's bind all these arms to the armature here. So just Control P with automatic weights. And let me just turn on the screencast keys so you can see what's going on. Alright, so let's just double check to see if everything's working. So again, we're going to be testing every time we work on something. So let's double check that's all working. That's working pretty good. That one's working fine. This one, obviously is not going to have much going on because it's only got the one joint, so that's working fine. And for this one, let's just double check to see this one's working. And yep, like a charm. Sweet. All right. So what we need to do now, at least in the case of the FK and IK controls, is we need to duplicate these joints. So let's just start with the FK for now. And I'm going to go into edit mode and push Shift D to duplicate. I'm going to move that to a new layer, just to keep things nice and organized. I'm going to pop into that layer in the Armature Properties tab. and I'm going to rename these as control. So I'm trying to keep things nice and consistent here because I will be planning on doing proper, you know, hierarchies with the rig in the future. So when we do a character rig, we'll be working with that in mind. So I want to make sure that, you know, I have my controls separated from my deform joints, because what you want to be able to do in the future is that when you have a fully made rig, you want to be able to know which joints are specifically for deformation and which ones are for mechanisms and which ones are for control. So keeping them nice and consistent and keeping them separate will make that life a lot easier in the future. So from now on in, what we need to do now for these controls for the FK is just give them some controls to work with. So we want to give them some control shapes. So again, check out the my robot arm tutorial. But basically, all you need to do is create some simple objects such as this. So in this case, I've got a circle here for my FKs. I got a basic sphere for some tweaks, and then I got a little triangle for my IK pole vector. So these are just straight up geometry. You can edit them as you will on a whim, all good. So you can actually edit them any way you like. And all I gotta do now is assign these controls, or these control joints or control bones, to have this mesh as a display object. So very simple, just go to the bone properties and then go to custom object and just eyedrop the controls. So now we have the control setup nice and easily selectable. So now we can actually, control these control joints with proper, controls. This next thing we need to do is make sure that we disable them as deformation joints. So if we ever had to reskin this arm rig, for instance, we won't accidentally do double deformations on it. So we don't want to have the controls deforming the hand. We want the deform joints controlling the hand. Okay, so we're just going to push Alt and then click uncheck deform, and then all the joints will be set to non-deforming. All right, the next thing we need to do, so I'm going to bring back my layers here, is make sure that we assign a constraint on the deformation joints to these controls here. So very simple, just select this hand joint, this control joint, and then constrain it by pushing Control Shift C, copy transforms, Control Shift C, copy transforms, Control Shift C, copy transforms. And basically that's all we need to do for the FK control rig. So that's up and running really well. So that's basically the very basic parameters for building out your FK control rig. All right, so very simple, nothing too fancy there. For the hand control, it's a little bit different because we only need to have one control joint for the hand, and the rest is going to be controlled by an elbow pole vector. So we actually have to create a secondary bone that exists around here somewhere. So for the IK, we only need to duplicate this hand here, this hand joint here. So I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to put that in the third layer just to keep things nice and consistent. And I'm going to name this as Control IK Hand. All right. Cool. And I stand corrected, actually. I do need to duplicate the other ones as well, so we can just quickly do that. So let's go back to our other joints. So what we need is to create the IK joint chain that will be constrained to the deformation joint as well. So we're going to duplicate that and put that into layer 3. So layer 3 with these joints. So this one will become a control joint, so that's fine. But because these ones won't be controlled directly, we want to call them something else. We're going to call them something like mechanisms. So these are mechanism joints at this point. They are going to be non-deforming, but we're not going to have direct control over them. They're just going to be sort of providing the mechanism to create the IK functionality. So we're going to call these MCH IK forearm 001 and MCH IK bicep 001. All right, and with this hand here, so we want to make sure that this one has no parenting affiliation with this joint chain here, because this hand will be controlling this arm. So in the opposite, so it's an inverse kinematics. So we need to think about that. So if we're still a child of this arm here, we're going to get some cyclic errors. So what we need to do is unparent this hand joint. So we're going to push Alt P and clear the parent. All right, so that's fine. And then we're going to extrude out in the X, in this case, a pole vector bone. And I'm going to Alt P that one as well. So I'm going to clear the parent and just bring that forward, or sideways in this case, to around that area there. And finally, I actually want to add a parent joint for the whole setup. So what I want to do is extrude out a parent joint, and this will become sort of like a global control. So I want to call this control global arm IK example 001. So normally I just call it control global, but in this case, because I'm just doing a demo here on how to actually construct an IK bone chain, I'm just making sure it's part of that group. So control global arm IK example 001. So now I want to make this bone, and this bone a child of that global control. So let's make sure that's the case. Control P, keep offset. And again, it's screwed up the parenting, so I want to make sure that, you know, it's parented properly. So I'm going to hide this temporarily by pushing H on the keyboard, select this one, and then this one, and then push, keep offset. So that will make it a child of that. Alt H to bring back the hidden object. And then I'm going to make sure that this bone as well is a child of that global control. So select that, hide it, select that, Control P, connected. It's already a child of that, so that's fine. That's good to see. So Alt H. Let's just make sure that this bone is clearly a child of that. So I might just temporarily pull that aside and just make sure this is a child of that bone. Keep offset. There we go. That's better. And then I'm just going to snap that back with a selection to cursor. Cool. And you can see that the orientation's all fucked up again, so we need to fix up that orientation by pushing Shift N, active bone. So that's all good. So we want to make sure that's still consistent with the rest of our deformed joints here. All right, so now we're ready to create the IK. So to do that, we have to go into pose mode. We're going to select this hand control, and then this arm forearm mechanism, and then push Control Shift C, IK, inverse kinematics. And if we test that out, you can see it's starting to work. And for some reason, this one is still a child of the wrong. Oh no, it's fine. Should be fine. And the reason why it's fucking up is because we need to change the chain length. So the chain length is 2, so we want the chain length to influence these two bones, so 1 and 2. So if we test that out again, you can see it's starting to work, but it's starting to spaz out as I get a bit low because the bone doesn't know where to orient itself. So what it needs is a pole vector to determine which way the IK is going to point towards. So to do that, I'm going to select my pole target, which will be this joint here, So I want to make sure that I've actually labeled this properly as well. So I'm going to call this IK bicep, IK arm. I'm going to call it IK pole arm. And in this case, I'm going to copy this name and then I'm going to just place it into the constraint. And you can see that the orientation of our bones here have actually flipped in the wrong direction. So we need to actually change the pole angle to match our original setup. So in this case, it will probably be around -90. And we can double check that by looking at our original deforming bones and making sure that's all lined up. So it looks like it's lined up pretty good. And if we test that out now, that bone's working fine. And if we move this global control, it's all moving together, which is really nice. All right, so what we need to do now is bring back our deforming joints and do the same thing we did with the IK, or the FK, sorry, and that is to add a copy transforms constraint to these bones here. So, but before we do that, let's just add some controllers to this. So in the hand IK control, I'm going to add the same visual custom object. And in this case, with the this control here, I'm going to use this as this little cone as a pole vector. So click on that and push OK. And again, with this base control, I'm going to do the same thing and choose this base as well. Like so. There we go. So now we have some nice controls to control everything. That's all good. The pole vector is working well. So you might be wondering if you're doing this for the first time and your control shapes aren't matching up with the direction you want, you have to actually go into edit mode with the object itself, the mesh object, and if you want to change the orientation of the control, you have to do it in edit mode. So you can see how it edits the shapes there. And there's tons of videos out there on how to do that, and I'm hoping that you have some experience in just basic rigging like this, but yeah, that's create your shapes, make sure you've oriented them properly, and then you can apply them as a custom object. And we'll get into more detail about that in the future as we build out our control rigs in the future. All right, cool. So now all we need to do is constrain this joint chain to our deforming joints. So let's do that now. So I'm going to select the control hand. I'm going to push Control Shift C and push copy transforms. Do the same thing along the chain, and you can see it's starting to work. And there we go. And very simple, we got ourselves a very basic IK control going on there. And that's how you build a very simple IK. So obviously this doesn't have any sort of twist controls in the hand. As you can see, it crushes as we over-rotate the hand there. But it gives you a gist and an idea of what we're going to achieve in the future when we start combining all these things together. All right, so let's move on to our bendy bones. So the bendy bone is a little bit different because we're only relying on one control for the whole thing. And similarly, we can actually add a base control as well. So we'll probably do that as well. So jumping into edit mode. So obviously we have the deformation bones here. So we need to duplicate. In this case, we only need to duplicate the one control, and then we'll have to build in that base control here, because literally this will be one bone that has no sort of constraints besides linking it up to a few sort of mechanism joints. There's no sort of overlapping of joints, so to speak. So what we're going to do, we're going to go into edit mode, and then we're going to just duplicate this hand control, and I'm going to put this on layer 4 again to make things nice and consistent. And in this case, again, I'm going to also extrude out a control for the base, and I'm going to put that on layer 4 as well. Okay, so what we will have is a bendy bone control, so I'm going to call that control BB hand 001. And in order to keep things consistent as well with this one, I'm just going to make sure I copy the same sort of convention there. So control global, in this case, it's going to be control global arm BB example 001. And again, this is just a demonstration of how to build out those bendy bones. So eventually, when we do build out the mechanisms for everything with a proper rig, we'll have different sort of naming conventions, so to speak. All right, so with bendy bones, we have to actually change the way that we're visually interpreting this setup here. So we need to actually change the display in the viewport display on our armature properties panel. So if we go to display as and change it from octahedral to B-bone, everything kind of turns into squares. And this is just a different way of visualizing the bone. It doesn't actually change the functionality, so to speak. But you can do a few things. So one thing you can do is actually scale the sort of width of the bone. It won't actually change the way it behaves, but it will change the way it's visualized. So what we can do, we can actually push Control Alt S on this bone to thin it out. And you can see, you can now we can make it a lot easier to select things as well. But what we're going to do first, in the bone settings, we're going to add segments. So we can add as many segments as we like, but in this case, I'm going to go with like 12. And you can see it sort of looks very similar to the subdivided bones that we have in our Spline IK example that we're going to get to in the future. All right. So before we get started, we need to do a few more things. This one, in this case, these are pure mechanism bones. We're going to extrude out a mechanism for this joint. And I'm going to maybe overextend it so it's easier to select as well. So actually selecting that hand control, I'm going to make it thinner. Selecting both of those, I'm going to make it thinner than the mechanism. All right, so with this mechanism, we're going to call it MCH BB arm out. .001. All right, so we have to do the same thing for the bottom. So we need to make an input as well. So we need to use this bone as another. We have to create another mechanism, so to speak. So we're going to do that by pushing Shift D, and then we're just going to bring that straight down. In this case, I'm not going to have it sit in line with the rest. I'm going to have the tail of the bone. So if we go back to if we go back to the octahedral view, we're going to have this tail line up with the base of the rest of our joint chain there. So just like that, just snap that to the top there, and making sure that all the the orientation of everything is aligned. You can see that in this case it's not, but it's okay. It's actually okay because it's just going to be a global control. But as long as this one's aligned with the rest of the joint chain, so Z going outwards like that, it should be fine. So that one's doing what I want it to do. All the other joints are aligned properly as well. So now we can move on. All right, so let's switch back into the B-bone visualization. And now we're ready to go into pose mode and add the constraints. But first, let's make sure that everything's named properly. And so in this case, it's going to be BB arm in. And this could be called start and end as well, according to our start handles and end handles there. All right, so that's named properly. This one's named properly. The BB arm's named properly. The arm out is named properly. The hand is named properly as a def, and then we have the control. So that's all good. All right, so let's start off with going into pose mode. And the first thing we need to do is create a couple of constraints. So the constraints are, firstly, on the bendy bone, it is called the damped track constraint. So the damped track constraint is basically a look at constraint. So if I move that around now, and hopefully I have to make sure that everything's unparented properly as well. So make sure that's unparented. So disconnect that bone, clear the parent, sorry, and make that a parent of the deform hand control. Keep offset. So if we were to move the deform hand, it just basically looks around, and you can see it's causing a cyclical error there because we haven't unparented everything. So we need to actually unparent everything, clear the parent, and then with the mechanism BBarm.out001, we're going to make it a child of the deform joint. So Control P again. And now if I were to move the BB arm, you can see it's looking at, it's basically tracking to that deformation joint. So again, let's do that again. We're going to add now a stretch to constraint, and that allows the bone to stretch just like that. So we're getting there. The only thing we haven't got now is the curviness or the toon-like effect that the bendy bone ought to have. So the next thing we need to do is add in the bone settings a start handle and an end handle, and that's where these mechanism bones come into play. So the end handle, or in this case the out, copy that, copy the name. We will designate that as our end handle in the bone setting there, and in the start handle, we're going to designate that in here in the bendy bone settings. And as you can see, if I try it out now, it won't work yet. So you can see it's not working quite yet. It's not bending. That's because we need to set it up to be set to absolute. So turn on those two functions to absolute. And now if we try moving the deform joint, you can see we're getting the effect that we need. And you can see it's working out pretty good so far. Only one issue is that this bone here should be a child of the global control. So we're going to make that a child of that global control, so it won't move when I move the deform handle. So now that's moving, behaving a lot more like we want. And you can see we're getting some twist in there as well, so we can get that twist in there. So we're getting all the functionality that we need out of that control. So all we need to do now is essentially constrain our control to our deformation. So our deformation will be constrained, to our control here. So grabbing that, we're going to undo that. We're going to select the control first, then shift select the deformation. You can see it's selected there. Control Shift C, copy transforms. And then now we can add those controls again. So we're going to add the same controls to our setup here. Add that custom object as our control. We're going to do the same for the global control there. Custom shape, like so. And we're going to make that a little bit larger, just like before. So now we're getting this effect where we can now control everything in one chunk. Pretty damn cool. So we can add one more control to this if we want to, and that is a control for this, where basically we create a base control that is now that will be a child of the global control. So what we can do to allow us to have even more flexibility is basically again, we're going to duplicate this BB hand control and just set it down at the bottom there. Shift S, selection to cursor. And we're going to make this control a child of this global control. Keep offset. So now nothing's happening at the moment, but it will once we make the handle and this bone a child of that control. So we're going to go like so. We're going to make this control and this control, this control, this deform joint and this mechanism joint a child of this joint at the bottom. So in edit mode, Control P, keep offset. Now if I were to move that, I get a sort of flexibility of both the top and bottom of our control here, and I can move the whole thing as a whole. So we have to make this global control everything else. So basically the hand control and the deformation hand will be a child of the global control. And we'll still get that functionality, but now we can move the whole thing together as a global control, just like in the robot arm tutorial, but in this case we have some twisty controls, which is really cool. All right, so now if we were to hide the deformations, we will have basically just 3 controls. We'll have the control for the hand, we'll have the control for the arm length, and then we have the global control, which is pretty cool. Same goes with everything else. So, you know, with these controls here, with these mechanism joints, so to speak, what we're going to do is actually move them into a layer underneath the IK here. So as a mechanism control, I like to make sure that they're organized in their own separate bone layer. So I can now choose my controllers. I can now access my mechanism joints, and then everything's fine and dandy. And the same thing is with this as well. So these mechanism joints will sit underneath in layer 4 as separate elements. So we can see here, they're now, you know, part of their own group or their own layer, so to speak. We have our control layers here, and then we have our deformation joints as, you know, sitting on their own. So we can easily access those for later. So far we've got in 20 minutes, we've got the FK control, we've got the IK control, and now we have the Bendy bone control, which is really cool. All right, so finally we've come to the Spline IK. So we can go back to the octahedral view, and the Spline IK is probably in some ways it's the trickiest one, because it requires you to have a bit more mental concentration to pull it off properly. But in other ways, it's in some ways it's actually more flexible overall. And the nice thing about the Spline IK is, at least with Blender 2.8 and upwards, is that because of the improvements to the dependency graph, the Spline IK is a lot more useful than it used to be in 2.7. Whereas in 2.7 you'd have a lot of scaling issues. You wouldn't be able to scale things properly, or things would just spaz out when you apply a Spline IK on top of an armature. In Blender 2.8 and above, they work really well together, which is perfect for some circumstances. Anyway, moving on. So what we need to do first in this regard is we need to create a Bezier curve, which will then be hooked with controllers that operate separately to this deformation joint chain. So let's start with the obvious first. So let's get the hand up and running, and we'll get a base control up and running as well, like a global control. So again, I'm going to go into edit mode and duplicate this hand control and put it into layer 5 in this case. All right, and again in this case I want to make a global control as well. So I'm going to duplicate this joint, Control D, and bring it down and snap it to this point here. And I'm going to call this one again. I keep forgetting my own naming conventions, so you know, let's just double check and see what I've gone with. It is global control, so I'm going to call that. In this case, I'm going to call it Control Global Spline SPIK Example 01. All right, make that a non-deforming joint as well, and same goes with this one as well, a non-deforming joint, because we don't want to affect the deformations in any way if we had to reskin it. All right, so this hand control again is going to be a child of this this global control. this hand control will also be called control spik hand.002. Alright, so going back into our first bone layer, we need to add 2 more control bones. So we need to add a control bone for the center of this this arm rig, and then we have to add a control for the bottom of the arm rig as well. So in this case, we'll have 3 points of control to work with in this circumstance. Okay, so to do that, again, I'm just going to duplicate this hand control again. So I'm going to duplicate that, just bring it down in a roughly centered line, you know, around that point. And then again, I'm going to duplicate that joint once more and bring it down to the base. And I might make that a little bit smaller, just so I can easily select that when the time comes. So I'm going to call this spik arm.001. And then spik for the second one, arm.002. And I'm just going to keep that one, you know, as is with hand. All right, so they will ultimately become our controls for the entirety of the rig. So we're only going to have 3 controls in this case, 3 controls for the length of the arm, and then a control for the base. And all of these controls in this case, for now, will be a child of our global control. So make sure that's a child of that global control. As you can see right now, this one, this global control needs to be cleared out. So that will be our global control there. We have this control for spik arm 001 is the right child. And again, this is the right child, and this is the right child. All right, let's put that aside for now and go into our length of our joint chains here. All right. So what we need to do, we have to go into our object mode, and we're going to temporarily hide the geometry. So we're going to go into our viewport display and just hide the mesh visibility for the time being, because it's just going to get in the way as we build out our spline. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a spline or a curve, just a regular Bezier curve, like so. And then in the snapping tool set, we're going to turn on snapping and then set it to vertice or vertex. And then with the, make sure that your spline visualization is turned on as well. The spline normals, if you're using 2.9, I think by default it's turned on or off, sorry. So you won't be able to see the arrows or the direction of that spline. So if you're in 2.9 and it's not turned on, just make sure normals is turned on so you can see what's going on. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to snap this point onto that joint. So at the end of our joint chain down the arm, we're going to snap it to here. And then this point here, we're going to snap it here. And you might be wondering, this thing looks like fuck, this all fucked up. The spline's fucked. So easy way to fix that, just right click, go to spline type, set it to poly. And then again, switch it back to Bezier, and then in the handle type, switch it back to aligned, and we have our perfectly aligned spline. And one thing I need to do next is to add a subdivision. So I want to have 3 points on this spline to work with, and we could also change the intensity of the spline handles. So you know these handles determine how intense the curve will be versus you know, when you deform the spline basically. So we'll adjust that in a moment. So with that all selected, right click and then go to subdivide, so we have an extra point in our chain there basically. So that looks good. The handles look at about the right length, which is good as well. So now in this spline, we're going to go to a constraints tab, and we're going to add 3 modifiers. We're going to go into the modify tab and add 3 hooks. So 1, and then we can actually, in Blender 2.9, we can actually push Shift D, fucking awesome, to duplicate that. So what we're going to do, we're going to hook in each particular individual set of points here to a specific joint in our joint chain. And that will be with our control joints. Okay, I hope that's making sense. So what we're going to do, we're going to make sure that we're, hooking to the armature firstly. So we're going to add the armature as our object, and then we have to assign the bone individually. So because we have named everything nice and neatly, so we got SPIK hand 002 as our control, we can actually rename that as 001, just so we know. We can now hook that point in the spline directly to that bone. So I like to do it manually like this because I find that when you just right click and then right click is blown, it never quite works out the way you want it to. So I'm going to select the entire point. So I want to make sure that all the point and its handles are selected. And then I'm going to go to my modifiers and then add the appropriate bone. So SPIK hand.001, as you can see, it's right there. And I'm going to push assign. I'm going to click that a few times just so I'm absolutely certain that it's been assigned to that bone. And then you can see here that the this point isn't quite aligned to our control here. So what we can do, we can actually bring that up a little bit before we hook it in. And we can go into our joints just to make sure we got the right name selected. So we're going to choose this hand. So we're going to just copy that SPIK arm 002 for that particular point. Make sure it's selected. Go to our hook number 2 and add that appropriate bone and push assign. And then finally, we'll do it for the last one as well. So we're going to select that point and we're going to choose SPIK 001 in this case. So that's what the bone is called, and push assign. All right, let's check this out. So now if we go into our pose mode now and try to manipulate that spline, you'll see that we get this action. Awesome. So it's working just as we want to. And you can see we've got one little error there. And that's because it didn't hook that goddamn other handle to the bone. So we need to fix that. Let's just double check to see if that one's working properly. This one's working as you'd expect. Perfect. Awesome. And then if we look at this one and we scale that up as well, that one's working as you'd expect as well. So that one's good. It's just this middle one that we need to fix up a little bit. So let's go into our spline, select that point, and we want to make sure that all the points are selected in this case. So this point, this point, and this point. And in hook 2, just push assign again. Assign, 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 assign. Just make sure it's nicely assigned. And now, if we go into our bone, move that around, and it looks like it's working. Let's just double check. And it's not. Why aren't you working? Let's go into our spline again and just double check to see if it's been properly sorted out. Let's go just go to the handle type in this case, and we're just going to realign these Beziers again. So in the handle type, let's just go to vector, and then try that again. Go to aligned. Let's make sure that's all good. Select those, and then push assign on that hook. Hopefully that will work. That looks a lot better. Awesome. Sweet. And that's exactly what we want. And now what we need to do is now assign the constraint to our deformation chain. So if we go to our joint chain now, add deforming joint chain, and add a Spline IK constraint to the top joint here, the top one here. Spline IK. Here it is. And make the target the Bezier curve. So in this case, Bezier curve 001. So you can actually eyedrop that from the outliner. You'll see we have to set up the chain length again. So in this case, it's 8 because we have 8 joints. And now, if we manipulate the appropriate control, we're getting this action. So the spline is dictating the maneuverability of that spline. And the reason why this is fucking up in the deform is that we have to unparent that, put that with our global control, and then add a transform constraint onto that. Or we can just straight up add a transform constraint to this right now. So without changing the hierarchy, we can just go Control C, copy transforms, set it to world space, and now that's working as you'd expect. So if we go to our controls here, doing everything we want it to do. And now if we bring back the mesh in our viewport and we try manipulating that, oops, let's just turn off the snapping. We're getting exactly what we need. Awesome. And we can scale up that, we can scale up the way that this thing deforms, which is awesome. We can scale this one up as well. Get that bendiness in there. You can slide it up and down the length of the chain, and then from the base we have this action as well, which is really cool. So what we need to do now is make sure that this global control is doing what we want it to. So right now it's controlling everything, which is awesome. And there's one thing we want to do to this Spline IK that I like to do in the settings of the Spline IK, and that is to turn off curve radius. So I don't want the global control to affect the scale, but I do want to turn on the XZ scale mode to volume preservation. So what the volume preservation will do, it will give you the ability to add squash and stretch. So if we control the control there, it thins out and gets squishy according to the deformation, which is cool. So that's cool. But if you don't like that, you can always disable that as well and just have it set to none. And that will keep it from stretching. It'll just stay the same thickness. So you have an option there. So I like to have it turned on to volume preservation. All right, so all we need to do now is add the appropriate controls. So back into our setup here, I'm going to select this control here, go to my viewport display, custom object, add that custom object, do the same thing in the Spline IK control there at the bottom, scale that up a little bit. One more for the global control, scale that one up a bit. And for the middle one, I'm just going to use a circle. So I'm just going to use this circle here, boom, as my my control there. So now if we look at the way this thing's functioning, perfect. You can see we're getting a few issues there with the twist there in the Spline IK, but there are ways to fix that. So let's just turn on that again and make sure that's not using that curve radius. Normally that would fix it, but for some reason it's not. But that's all right. So all we've got to do now is make sure that this bone chain here, the one that's actually deforming the arm, is a child of the appropriate control at the end here. So in this case, it's going to be a child of the global arm shape control. Or actually, it might be a child of the global control completely, not just the this control IK. It'll be a child of the global control, because that way we can scale this curve without scaling the entire arm. So this deform joint here will be a child of the global control there. So set it to keep offset. So now that we rotate that, it will rotate without crushing the hand, and it should scale appropriately. And the reason that's not scaling properly is because the IK control needs a few more parameters to be set, and I turned it off earlier, but I have to turn it back on. So I have to turn on curve radius, use curve radius. So keep that turned off. So turn off curve radius, but set it to XZ scale mode to either bone original, so it allows you to scale accordingly, or you can set it to volume preservation, which will allow you to have that squash and stretch. So it allows you to squish and squash that bone. So that's how you build out that Spline IK setup. So now if I try manipulating this around, obviously the hand's going to scroll up with that, so that's okay. That's fine. That's because it's the deformation hand is constrained on the with a copy transform. So if we wanted to, we can actually just set it to just copy rotation and copy location, but not copy the scale, and then have this deformation bone a child of the global as it is there. So it will still scale appropriately. It should scale appropriately. But now if we scale up the curve, it won't affect the scale of the hand. Like so. Let's just fix up that scaling issue with the volume preservation there as well. So the reason why this is not working again is that we have to set up use original scale. So, you know, as long as the original scale is turned on, it will scale with the entirety of our global control. But we'll still have squash and stretch in the control there. And if I were to manipulate the scale of everything on the hand, it would only manipulate the curvature of the hand, and it will allow me to do cool shit like this. That's how you build out a Spline IK control. And as I said, it's a lot more complicated than the rest, but ultimately, once you get it to work, like I said in the previous video, it's really satisfying to see it have this amount of flexibility. So yeah, that's all 4 different mainline approaches that I'm going to be using in my rigs. And before we wrap up, I may as well show you, at least in one of these circumstances, how we can combine the bendy bones with, say, an IK control or an FK control setup to get that wrist twist working. So the bendy bone doesn't quite work with the IK, the Spline IK, because we have so many subdivisions, but with something like this, in bendy bone preview, we can actually subdivide these and turn it into having this level of twist action for the forearm twist, for instance. So let's just do this as an example for one of these controllers. So let's try it out with the FK control setup here. So I'm just going to go into my edit mode here. I'm going to select this bone. Make sure I'm selecting the deformation bones in this case. So I'm in the first layer. Just going to scale that down in the B-bone preview sort of mode, and then I'm going to increase some segments on this bendy bone, so I have this action going on. All right, let's jump into pose mode and see what's going on here. So not much is going on at the moment, but if we try to manipulate the forearm now, we're getting a sort of bendy bone action, kind of sort of speaking, but not in the way we want. So we're getting a little bit going on, so we can actually see the bendy bones actually working already. Just like, I'm surprised it actually is working there. Automatically we're getting that sort of action with the twist, which is really cool to see. But we want to decrease the effect it has in the actual forearm. So in edit mode, we need to go into the ease in and ease out functionality there and set that to 0. So now we still get that hard edge there, but let's see if the twist still works. If it doesn't work, that's fine. You can see here, we've got some forearm twist going on, even without the in and out functionality, which is super cool because of the automatic start handles that's been set up at the moment. For more complex setups for the forearm twist, we'd have to actually build in the start and end handles for more toony setups. But the nice thing is that for a quick and easy forearm twist, we have this functionality available for us. And of course, if we overextend it, it will snap, but that's okay. For 90% of what we need, that's perfect. So let's give it a quick little go with this one as well, just because we can. With the IK, see how it works. Add some bendy bones, add as many divisions as you want. It could be 7, it could be 8, doesn't matter. And let's turn off, in edit mode, we're going to turn off that easing as well. So go into edit mode, turn off the ease to 0 and 0. So we don't have that easing. And if we go into our control setup now and try twisting that forearm, it also works really, really well. How awesome is that? So we have the IK sort of set up, but we still have that forearm twist working dynamically. How awesome is that? The only unfortunate thing with this setup is that the goddamn Bendy Bone system can't be exported as an FBX. But you know, if you're working within Blender, it's perfect because you can make some really cartoony films with that sort of setup. Anyway, let's hide all of those deformation joints and reiterate what we've done. So let's summarize. So we've got our FK working really well, with some forearm twist, which is a bonus feature. We have the IK working with this setup where the elbow can be controlled with that sort of setup. And again, we've added some forearm twist as well, which is nifty. Awesome. And then we have our full bendy bone setup, which is just one joint doing all the hard work, which is fucking fantastic. And then we have our Spline IK system, which gives us ultimate control over everything, including the intensity of the spline as we work with it. You know, and because we have global controls on all of these, I mean, the FK doesn't really need one, but you know, we can still move it around, we can scale it up, perfect. We can move this one around, scale it up, rotate it around, awesome. Same with this one, brilliant. And especially with this one was a bit of a pain in the ass to get set up, but it's all working to plan. How great is that? So, I mean, this is a bit of a long video, but it's important to get these ideas across to you as soon as possible as we get into the nitty-gritty of building out our control rigs for a more fleshed out character. All right, so with that in mind, give this a go, have a practice before we jump into everything. This is a great starter experiment. You can use your own arm setup for this, your own hand setup. You can even use like a basic tube with subdivisions to make this work as well. So give it a go, take some time to practice, and let me know how you go. But until then, until we get to the next video, which is all about breaking up or constructing the underlying deformation rig for a character, I will say catches and have fun.